The construction crew thought Lars Henriksen had lost his mind. It was 1923, and the railroad was pushing through northern Saskatchewan, building infrastructure for what would become a major transportation route through the Canadian wilderness. The company had brought in prefabricated wooden bunkhouses for the workers, modern structures with milled lumber, tar paper roofing, and cast iron stoves. Each bunkhouse cost the railroad company $300 and housed 12 men. They were considered adequate shelter for the harsh climate. Not luxurious, but functional. Lars Henriksen arrived at the railroad camp in August with different plans. He was 56 years old, a Norwegian immigrant who'd spent 3 decades in the far north. He'd trapped in Alaska, prospected in the Yukon, and worked construction across the territories. He'd survived winters that killed lesser men. He'd seen what worked and what failed when the real cold arrived. And he'd decided that the company bunkhouses were death traps waiting for the right storm. When Lars announced he was building his own shelter, the other workers were curious. When they saw what he was building, they laughed. Lars was constructing walls out of dirt. Not dirt blocks, not adobe bricks, not even rammed earth in the proper sense. Lars was building what looked like mud piles shaped into walls. He dug a rectangular pit about 3 feet deep and 16 feet by 20 feet across. Then he'd started mixing soil with water and prairie grass, creating a thick mud. He'd pile this mud mixture onto wooden frames, building walls that were 4 feet thick at the base and tapering to 2 feet thick at the top. The walls rose slowly, about 6 inches per day, because each layer had to partially dry before adding the next. The process was slow, labor-intensive, and produced a structure that looked like something a child would build with mud pies. The other railroad workers mocked him constantly. "Hey Lars, you building a beaver dam? Looks like a mud puddle with walls. What happens when it rains? Your house gonna melt." Indians stopped living in mud huts 100 years ago. Lars ignored the comments. He'd heard it all before. Every time he'd built this type of shelter, people laughed. Then winter came and the laughing stopped. He kept working. Mix mud, layer it on the frames, let it dry, repeat, week after week through August and September as the weather got colder. By October, his walls were complete, 7 feet tall, massively thick, solid enough to walk on top of. For the roof, Lars used a different approach. He'd saved milled lumber for this part, recognizing that some elements of modern construction were actually improvements. He built a proper timber frame roof with a steep pitch for snow shedding. Over the timber frame went layers of sod, cut from the prairie and laid grass side up, roots intertwined to hold everything together. Over the sod went a layer of canvas, waterproofing. Over the canvas went another layer of sod. The roof was nearly 2 feet thick when finished, a massive weight that the thick mud walls could easily support. The whole structure looked like a grass-covered hill with a door. Inside, Lars had done something else the other workers found strange. He'd built his fireplace and chimney in the center of the structure, not against a wall. The fireplace was made from stone and had a large mass of stone and brick surrounding it, creating what looked like an oversized chimney base that took up a significant portion of the interior space. Lars explained that this central thermal mass would radiate heat in all directions, warming the entire shelter. Building the fireplace against an outer wall, as the bunkhouses had done, meant half the heat radiated uselessly to the exterior. The other workers shook their heads. More strange ideas from the crazy Norwegian. Lars moved into his shelter in late October. The structure had cost him almost nothing. He'd used materials from the site: dirt, grass, stones. He'd purchased some lumber for the roof frame and a length of stovepipe for the chimney. Total cost, maybe $30. The railroad bunkhouses cost $300 each. But cost wasn't the point. Performance was the point. And Lars knew that when the real cold arrived, performance was the difference between life and death. By November, the bunkhouses were struggling. The railroad workers complained constantly about drafts, cold floors, and uneven heat. The cast iron stoves consumed enormous amounts of firewood, but the bunkhouses stayed barely tolerable. Men would huddle near the stoves, roasting on one side and freezing on the other. Lars's shelter, by contrast, was comfortable. The thick earth walls provided insulation that wooden walls couldn't match. The sunken floor, below ground level, put the living space in contact with the earth's thermal mass, which stayed warmer than the frigid air above. The central fireplace radiated heat evenly, and the massive thickness of the walls meant that once warmed, the shelter held its heat for hours, even after the fire died down. Lars burned a fraction of the firewood the bunkhouses used and stayed warmer. The workers who'd mocked his dirt walls started asking questions. How does it work? How warm does it get? How much wood do you burn? Then December arrived, and with it came cold that even the old-timers hadn't seen before. The temperature dropped through November, reaching -20, -30. By early December, it was -40 regularly, but that was just the beginning. On December 14th, 1923, an Arctic front moved south out of the polar regions. This wasn't normal cold. This was the kind of cold that froze whiskey solid in the bottle, that made breath freeze and fall to the ground as ice crystals, that killed exposed skin in under 2 minutes. The temperature dropped to -47 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind, chill made it feel like -70 or worse. The storm lasted 5 days. The railroad bunkhouses became frozen boxes. The cast iron stoves roared constantly, burning firewood as fast as men could feed them, but they couldn't keep up with the cold. The interior temperature of the bunkhouses dropped to near freezing even with the fires maxed out. Ice formed on the inside walls, frost coated every surface. Men slept in all their clothes, under every blanket they owned, and still shivered through the night. Several cases of frostbite occurred from men sleeping too near the cold walls. 2 men died, overcome by hypothermia in their beds while the stoves burned just feet away. The thin wooden walls provided almost no insulation against the extreme cold. The heat generated by the stoves was lost almost as fast as it was produced. Lars's dirt wall shelter performed completely differently. The massive thermal mass of the earth walls absorbed heat from the fireplace and radiated it slowly back into the space. The 4-foot-thick walls created such effective insulation that external temperature became almost irrelevant. The sunken floor meant the living space was surrounded by earth on 5 sides, 4 walls, and the floor. Only the roof was exposed to the cold air, and even the roof had 2 feet of insulation in the form of sod layers. Lars kept a moderate fire going, nothing like the roaring blazes in the bunkhouses. His shelter stayed at a comfortable 60 degrees. Not hot, but warm enough to sleep without heavy blankets. Warm enough to move around in a single layer of clothing. Warm enough to be genuinely comfortable while men 100 yards away were fighting for survival. The difference was so dramatic that on the 3rd day of the cold snap, the railroad foreman came to Lars's shelter to see it for himself. He knocked on the door. Lars opened it and warm air spilled out into the Arctic night. The foreman stepped inside and stood in shock. It was warm. Actually warm. The walls radiated gentle heat. The air was comfortable. A small fire burned in the central fireplace, but it wasn't the roaring inferno he'd expected. "How is this possible?" the foreman asked. Lars explained the principles: thermal mass, insulation, Earth's natural temperature regulation. The foreman listened, but seemed to only partially understand. All he knew for certain was that the dirt-walled shelter everyone had mocked was the only structure in camp where a man could be comfortable during the worst cold in living memory. Word spread quickly. By the 4th day of the cold snap, Lars had a constant stream of visitors. Workers would come to his shelter just to warm up, standing inside for 20 minutes before heading back to their frozen bunkhouses. Some asked if they could sleep on his floor. Lars took in as many as he could fit, maybe 8 or 10 men at a time, rotating them so everyone got a chance to warm up and rest properly. His shelter became a refuge, the only place in camp where survival wasn't a constant struggle. The workers who'd laughed at the dirt walls now owed their lives to them. When the cold snap finally broke on December 19th, the difference in conditions was clear. The men who'd spent time in Lars's shelter were healthy and rested. The men who'd stayed in the bunkhouses were exhausted, sick, and traumatized by 5 days of fighting the cold. If you're fascinated by this story of ancient building methods outperforming modern construction, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We're uncovering forgotten knowledge that kept our ancestors alive in conditions that defeat modern technology. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next episode. The railroad company held an emergency meeting after the cold snap. They'd lost 2 men and nearly lost several others. The bunkhouses were clearly inadequate for extreme conditions. They needed a better solution. The construction supervisor suggested building more structures like Lars's shelter. The company executives were reluctant. Building with dirt seemed primitive and unprofessional. What would people think? But the numbers were compelling. Lars's shelter had cost $30 and had kept everyone inside comfortable through cold that nearly killed men in $300 bunkhouses. The return on investment was obvious. The company commissioned Lars to supervise construction of 6 more earth-sheltered structures. He trained a crew of workers in the techniques. They built through the rest of winter and into spring. By the following winter, the railroad camp had a mix of wooden bunkhouses and earth shelters. When the cold came again, not as severe as the previous year but still brutal, the difference was again obvious. The earth shelters stayed warm with minimal fuel. The wooden bunkhouses struggled. More workers requested transfers to the earth shelters. Within 2 years, the company had stopped building wooden bunkhouses entirely for their northern camps. Earth-sheltered structures became standard, though they called them thermal-efficient housing, rather than dirt wall shelters, for marketing reasons. What Lars had built was a structure type with ancient roots. Humans had been building earth-sheltered homes for thousands of years, across many cultures. The thick earthen walls provided mass and insulation. The underground or partially underground design utilized the Earth's natural temperature regulation. Deep soil maintains a relatively constant temperature year-round, typically around 45 to 55 degrees, at depths of 6 to 8 feet, regardless of surface conditions. By building into or against the Earth, structures could tap into this stable temperature. In summer, this meant cooling. In winter, it meant the Earth was much warmer than the air. A structure surrounded by 50-degree Earth was starting from a much better baseline than a structure surrounded by -47-degree air. The specific techniques Lars used came from Norwegian building traditions adapted for North American conditions. In Norway, especially in the far north, earth-sheltered construction had been used for centuries. The traditional gammy was a semi-subterranean dwelling with earth walls and a turf roof. Variations existed across Scandinavia, from Iceland to Finland. These structures had proven themselves through countless Arctic winters. They kept occupants warm without excessive fuel consumption. They were durable, lasting for decades or even centuries with proper maintenance. And they were built from materials available on-site, requiring minimal purchased inputs. Lars had grown up with these buildings. He'd learned the construction techniques from his father and grandfather. When he came to North America, he brought this knowledge with him. The key technical elements of Lars's design were worth examining in detail. First, the sunken floor. By excavating 3 feet down, Lars put his living space partially underground. This had multiple benefits. The earth provided insulation on all sides. The floor was in contact with deep soil that stayed much warmer than the surface. The sunken design also provided wind protection, as the walls extended above ground level by only 4 to 5 feet, reducing the profile exposed to wind. Modern earth-sheltered homes often use this same technique, though they typically excavate deeper and use modern waterproofing materials. Second, the wall thickness and composition. Lars's walls were 4 feet thick at the base, tapering to 2 feet at the top. This massive thickness provided enormous thermal mass and excellent insulation. The composition, earth mixed with grass, created a material that was both strong and insulating. The grass fibers reinforced the mud, preventing cracking and providing structural integrity. Modern testing of similar earthen materials shows insulation values of about R2 to R3 per inch, meaning Lars's 2 to 4 foot thick walls had insulation values of R24 to R48. For comparison, a typical modern wood-framed wall with insulation has a value of R13 to R20. Lars's walls were actually better insulated than modern construction, and they had vastly greater thermal mass. Third, the roof design. The steep pitch sheds snow effectively, preventing dangerous loads from accumulating. The multiple layers, timber frame, sod, canvas, and more sod, provided both waterproofing and insulation. The grass roots in the sod layers bound the material together, creating a living roof that improved over time as the grass grew and strengthened. Modern green roofs use similar principles, though with engineered drainage layers and waterproof membranes. Lars's simpler system worked just as well for his purposes. The total roof insulation was probably R15 to R20, much better than the minimally insulated roofs of the bunkhouses. Fourth, the central thermal mass fireplace. This was perhaps Lars's most important innovation, or rather his preservation of an ancient innovation that modern builders had forgotten. By placing the fireplace in the center of the structure and building a massive stone surround, Lars created a heat battery. The stone absorbed heat from the fire and released it slowly over many hours. This meant the shelter stayed warm long after the fire died down. The radiant heat from the stone warmed all walls equally, preventing cold spots. Modern rocket mass heaters and masonry stoves use this same principle, but they're rare in mainstream construction. Most modern fireplaces vent heat straight up the chimney and provide minimal radiant heating, making them inefficient for space heating. Fifth, the ventilation design. Lars had built-in ventilation ports that could be opened or closed. These allowed fresh air intake and moisture exhaust without creating drafts. The ports were positioned to create natural convection. Cool air entered low, was warmed by the fire, rose, and exited high. This created continuous air exchange without forcing cold air directly into the living space. The massive thermal mass of the walls and fireplace meant this incoming air was quickly warmed to room temperature. Modern earth-sheltered homes often struggle with ventilation and moisture control. Lars's simple system handled both issues effectively. The thermal performance of Lars's shelter was superior to the bunkhouses for multiple reasons working together. The bunkhouses had thin walls, with minimal insulation, small thermal mass, heat sources against exterior walls, and high air infiltration through gaps and cracks. They were fighting a losing battle against the cold. The heat generated inside was lost almost immediately through the walls and roof. Lars's shelter had thick, well-insulated walls with enormous thermal mass, a heat source in the center radiating to all walls, and controlled ventilation that prevented heat loss while maintaining air quality. The shelter wasn't fighting the cold, it was using physical principles to create a stable, warm environment regardless of external conditions. The psychological aspect was also significant. The bunkhouse workers knew their shelter was barely adequate. They could feel the cold pressing in. They worried constantly about the fire going out. They couldn't relax or sleep well because they were always cold or worried about becoming cold. This stress compounded the physical toll of the cold. Lars and the people in his shelter could relax. They knew they were safe. They could sleep soundly, knowing the shelter would stay warm. This psychological security was almost as important as the physical warmth. Stress and fear consume energy and weaken the body's ability to resist cold. Feeling safe and warm preserves energy and maintains health. The construction techniques Lars used were not difficult, but they required patience and attention to detail. The mud mixing had to achieve the right consistency, wet enough to be workable but not so wet it wouldn't hold shape. The layering had to allow partial drying between layers to prevent slumping. The grass reinforcement had to be distributed evenly throughout the mud. The wall thickness had to be maintained as layers were added. These weren't complex skills, but they required practice and care. Modern construction workers, accustomed to precision-cut lumber and exact measurements, initially found the mud work frustrating. It was more art than engineering, requiring judgment and feel rather than following blueprints exactly. But once they learned the techniques, the workers Lars trained became advocates for earth building. They'd seen firsthand that it worked. They'd experienced the comfort of a well-built earth shelter versus the inadequacy of conventional construction in extreme cold. Some of these workers went on to build earth-sheltered homes for themselves in later years. A few became specialists in earth building, traveling to construction sites across the north to build shelters for mining camps, railroad camps, and isolated settlements. The knowledge spread slowly through this network of practitioners, though it never became mainstream. The economic advantages were substantial. The material cost was minimal since earth was free at the construction site. Labor cost was the main expense, but earth building was less skilled than carpentry, meaning lower wages for workers. The construction time was longer than for wooden structures, but the finished building lasted much longer and required less maintenance. There was no paint to refresh, no siding to replace, no shingles to repair. The earth walls were essentially permanent. The only maintenance was occasional patching of minor cracks and ensuring the roof remained waterproof. Over the lifespan of the building, earth construction was far cheaper than conventional construction. The environmental advantages were also significant, though people in 1923 didn't think in those terms. Earth building used local materials, eliminating the energy cost of transporting lumber from distant sawmills. It required no chemical treatments or preservatives. At the end of its useful life, an earth structure simply returned to the ground, leaving no waste or pollution. Modern sustainability advocates recognize earth building as one of the most environmentally friendly construction methods available. But in Lars's time, the appeal was purely practical. It was cheap, it worked, and it used what was available on site. The social impact was more subtle but real. Earth building was accessible to people with limited funds. Someone without money for milled lumber could still build adequate shelter. This democratized housing, making it possible for poor workers to have comfortable homes. It also promoted self-reliance. A person who understood earth-building principles could construct shelter anywhere with minimal purchased materials. This independence was valuable in frontier regions where commercial building supplies were expensive and hard to obtain. The knowledge empowered individuals to meet their own basic needs rather than depending on commercial suppliers. However, earth building also faced social stigma. Despite its superior performance, it was seen as primitive and lower class. Company executives were embarrassed that their workers lived in mud huts, even though those mud huts were more comfortable and effective than the wooden buildings. When visitors came to the railroad camps, they were shown the conventional wooden structures, not the earth shelters, because the earth shelters didn't project the image of modern progress the company wanted. This tension between practical effectiveness and social perception limited the spread of earth building. Many people would rather live in an inadequate but respectable-looking wooden house than a superior but primitive-looking earth shelter. This social dynamic continues today. Earth-sheltered homes and earth-bag construction are recognized by building professionals as effective and sustainable. But they remain rare because most people don't want to live in a house that looks different from conventional homes. Social conformity pressures people towards standard construction even when alternatives might serve them better. Breaking through this stigma requires changing cultural perceptions, which is difficult and slow. Lars didn't worry about perceptions, he cared only about effectiveness. But most people aren't willing to be social outsiders for the sake of better shelter. The technical knowledge of earth building gradually declined as conventional construction became standard. By mid-century, few builders in North America knew how to work with earth. The skills survived in pockets. kept alive by a handful of practitioners, but they were no longer common knowledge. Building codes also worked against earth construction. Codes were written around conventional materials and methods. Earth building often didn't fit code requirements, not because it was unsafe, but because it was different. Getting approval for non-standard construction was difficult, discouraging people from attempting it. The regulatory system, designed to ensure safety, inadvertently suppressed alternative methods that might have been superior. The revival of interest in earth building began in the 1970s with the alternative building movement. Architects and builders interested in sustainability, affordability, and low environmental impact rediscovered traditional earth-building methods. They studied historical examples, including structures like Lars's. They experimented with modernizing the techniques, incorporating elements like vapor barriers, engineered drainage, and modern insulation materials where they added value. They wrote books, taught workshops, and built demonstration projects. The knowledge began spreading again, though from a very small base. Today, earth building is a recognized specialty within sustainable construction, but it's still far from mainstream. Modern earth-sheltered homes can achieve remarkable performance. Properly designed and built, they maintain stable interior temperatures with minimal heating or cooling. They're quiet as the earth mass absorbs sound. They're durable, lasting indefinitely with minimal maintenance. They're disaster-resistant, able to withstand fires, tornadoes, and earthquakes that would destroy conventional structures. They offer all these advantages while often costing less to build than conventional homes. The main barriers are regulatory hurdles, financing difficulties, and social perceptions, not technical or economic factors. Before we conclude, I want to ask you to subscribe if you haven't already. We're bringing back lost building knowledge that outperformed modern construction in the harshest conditions. Your support keeps us researching these forgotten methods. Hit that subscribe button now. Lars Henriksen continued building earth shelters throughout his career. He worked on railroad and mining projects across northern Canada and Alaska through the 1920s and into the 30s. He trained dozens of workers in earth-building techniques. He refined his methods, learning what worked best in different soil types and climates. By the time he retired in 1938 at age 71, he'd built or supervised construction of over 50 earth-sheltered structures. Many of these structures were still in use decades later. Some remained occupied into the 1980s and 90s, providing comfortable shelter for over 60 years with minimal maintenance. This longevity demonstrated the durability of well-built earth construction. Lars died in 1945 at age 78, living his final years in a small earth-sheltered home he'd built for himself outside of Whitehorse in the Yukon Territory. The home was warm, comfortable, and cheap to heat even in the brutal Yukon winters. He'd proven his point. Earth building wasn't primitive or inferior. It was sophisticated, effective, and in many ways superior to conventional construction for harsh climates. The workers who'd laughed at his dirt walls in 1923 had learned the truth during that minus 47-degree cold snap. The best shelter wasn't the one that looked most modern or cost the most money. It was the one that kept you alive and comfortable when the real cold arrived. The lessons from Lars's dirt wall shelter remain relevant today. First, don't dismiss traditional methods as primitive without understanding their principles. What looks simple or crude might actually be sophisticated and highly effective. Second, thermal mass and insulation are often more important than active heating systems. A well-designed structure that holds heat naturally requires minimal energy input. Third, building codes and social perceptions shouldn't override practical effectiveness. If an alternative method works better, it deserves serious consideration regardless of how unconventional it appears. Fourth, local materials and simple techniques can outperform expensive, complex systems. Lars's $30 earth shelter Outperformed $300 bunkhouses not through complexity, but through understanding of basic physics and intelligent design. Fifth, extreme conditions reveal what actually works versus what just looks good. The minus 47-degree cold snap was a harsh teacher, but it taught lessons that couldn't be ignored. When survival is on the line, performance matters more than appearances. Sixth, knowledge held by individuals outside mainstream institutions can be valuable. Lars wasn't an engineer or architect. He was a worker with traditional knowledge from his cultural background. That knowledge proved superior to the professional designs of the railroad company's engineers. The story of the dirt wall shelter that survived the Arctic front is ultimately about humility, about recognizing that our assumptions about modern superiority might be wrong, about being willing to learn from the past, and about valuing effectiveness over appearances. The workers who laughed at Lars's shelter made a natural mistake. They assumed that modern materials and methods must be better than what looked like a mud hut. They were wrong, and that mistake nearly cost lives. We make similar mistakes today, assuming that contemporary practices are superior to historical ones, that technology always represents progress, that new must be better than old. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. The key is being willing to evaluate methods on their actual performance rather than on how modern or primitive they appear. Lars's dirt wall shelter looked primitive. It performed brilliantly. The modern bunkhouses looked professional and up to date. They nearly killed the men inside them when real cold arrived. Appearances deceived. Performance revealed truth. That lesson, learned in the brutal cold of a Saskatchewan winter in 1923, remains valid in every field where we must choose between traditional knowledge and modern methods. Sometimes the old ways work better. Sometimes the primitive approach is actually more sophisticated. Sometimes everyone laughing at the different person doesn't mean that person is wrong. Sometimes it means everyone else hasn't yet learned what that person already knows. And sometimes it takes a minus 47-degree night to teach that lesson to those who wouldn't learn it any other way.